Hello, I'm Kate Ball. I'm the founder of Mini First Aid, and welcome to our podcast Family Health by Mini First Aid. It is brilliant to hear that you've been enjoying our new Family Health podcast series, where we will continue to bring you some of the top family health advice from our leading experts. So this week is a bit different in our usual podcast, folks, because today I'm joined by writer Jackie Burton, and Jackie is going to be interviewing me, and she's going to be chatting to me about my personal experience of a condition called cardiomyopathy, which very tragically my brother Matt died from at the age of 22. And whilst it's a very difficult story to tell, I feel it's one that so many of you will be interested to hear, but also to understand more about this potentially life-threatening condition. Series 1 of Family Health by Mini First Aid podcast is sponsored by Savlon Scar Prevention Gel. Savlon Scar Prevention Gel helps soothe pain, promote faster healing, as well as reducing the risk of scarring when used on minor wounds, superficial burns and grazes. With 6 children in my house, scrapes and cuts are plentiful, so my first aid box saviour is Savlon Scar Prevention Gel.
Thank you for joining me today, Kate.
Pleasure.
I know that you've taken some time out from this busy schedule between running a business and managing your big brood of 6, so I really appreciate it. I know that when people ask you about Mini First Aid, you talk all the time about CPR, about choking, about all the different elements of the different classes you currently run.
Yeah.
And you quite often talk about all the stuff that you juggle, and you juggle as a mum. But I just wanted to talk about something a bit different today and a bit more personal. Mm-hmm. I wanted to talk to you about your brother.
Okay.
About your brother Matt. I know that you've written a little bit about him, and you have been candid in talking about him. But I just wanted to dig in a little bit more, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
Now I understand that your brother had a condition called cardiomyopathy, and we'll come to that later. But I just wanted to know a little bit more about him as a person first, like what he was like.
So my memory of my brother and I in our childhood is hugely lovely. You know, we got on really, really well. We've got these lovely photos of us as very little ones playing together. I think as we grew up, my mum would tell you and would roll her eyes about the fact that we just used to take pieces out of each other. And he used to call me Fatty. That was my nickname. I don't think I was particularly overweight at all, in fact, but
standard sibling stuff.
Yeah. We had a bench in our kitchen which used to wobble a bit, and if I came and sat on it when he was sitting in it, he'd go, "Whoa, Fatty." And we used to really argue. And I know that we had a particular holiday which was a huge expense for my parents. They took us to Canada for this once in a lifetime amazing experience holiday, and we spoilt it apparently because we fought all the time and ended up with my mum sitting in the back of the car so that she could separate us and one could sit in the front with my dad. But strangely enough, I've got no memory of that. My memory is just that he was my brother, he was my pal, very fond memories. And then as we grew older, there was 20 months between us. But as we grew older, we were 2 school years apart. He needed me for certain things, and those certain things were if he wanted to have a house party or mates over if my parents were away, the deal was I had to be there. So suddenly he needed me a lot. So I used to spend a lot of his house parties. I was a bit of a goody two-shoes. I would go around with a bin liner, clearing up the beer cans, telling people off for smoking and all that sort of stuff. But he needed me because that was the thing. So actually, as we sort of grew towards it was the end of our relationship, I guess, was this, that we were really good mates. And so yeah, very, very fond memories.
Oh. And then you both went off to university.
Yeah.
So you went one way, and then...
Yes.
And you finished university?
Yeah.
A couple of years ahead of Matt?
Yeah, that's right. So I went off to Cardiff University.
Right.
I did have a year out before I went to university, but I went to Cardiff University and Matt went to Portsmouth. I can't quite remember how the years overlapped, but I had certainly finished university, and both of us decided, or had early decided to stay on in the cities that we'd studied in. So I stayed on in Cardiff,
right,
and I think Matt's plan was, for the time being, was to stay on in Portsmouth.
What did he study, by the way?
He studied geography. Loved it, was really good at it. I remember looking round, I don't know why, but I went to the University Open Day with him, and I remember looking around the geography department, and there were all these sort of maps on the wall of different cuts of landscape and ordnance survey type stuff, and him being fascinated by it, and me sort of thinking, all right, okay. I did the social sciences, the talky bit, and the soft skill stuff, and he did geography, and seemingly was incredibly good at it as well. He was a real academic, much more so than I was.
Right, okay. Oh, and then so he'd come to the end of university, and am I right in thinking you were sort of maybe 23 by then and Matt was 22?
Yeah, that's right. So I was working, so I had a job, I had a graduate job in a recruitment company, so I was working in an office. And he finished his degree, so he had literally finished his finals. So this is sort of very early June, and he had finished his finals. He'd taken all of his exams, and on the last day of his exams, they'd all gone out to celebrate. And I don't know timing wise, but I can only assume that his department or his exams was one of the last, because very much once his exam was done, it was the big celebration with his mates, and they went out in Portsmouth.
They'd all gone out together.
They went out and had a great night, and they took with them a circa 1990s video camera and recorded their night out. So they actually took footage of them drinking, mucking about, all that sort of stuff throughout the night. When they were out on their big night out.
And that was the night. So Matt had gone onto the beach with some friends.
Yeah. So he they'd got to about, we think, about sort of the early hours of the morning, 3-4 o'clock in the morning, which now for most of us would be like, crikey, be in bed. But they had this idea that it would be nice to have the first day of having finished university, I guess, being a graduate, to see the sun come up. And those people who know Portsmouth will know that Southsea Beach is an infamous beach. So they went down to Southsea Beach, just near to the pier on Southsea Beach, just to muck around on the beach. And we have this as video footage. So because they had this video camera with them, they're all running around and they're playing chase and just mucking about on the beach. And everybody clearly had quite a bit to drink, but not in the level that, they were out of control. They were just having a good time.
Celebrating.
It was a good party. So they were down on the beach, and my brother was running and being chased by people up and down the beach, and he comes back to the shot of the camera and says, "I'm knackered." And then the camera's off then, and he lies down. And he lay down. I guess I've got in my head this visual of him sort of doing this. I don't know whether that's exactly what he did, but doing this as the sun is coming up. He says, "I'm knackered," and then he died. And he, according to the friends that were on the scene, he made a funny noise, whether it was a last intake of breath or some sort of noise that alerted them to look at him.
Right, okay.
And they then realised that something was not right. That he'd stopped breathing and that something wasn't right and something very serious had happened.
And do you think that initial reaction was panic?
I can only imagine that it would be complete and utter panic. And I think for the young people that were there, how you ever get past that of seeing somebody whom they loved, he was one of their best friends, he was also a very integral part of that group of friends. And the sheer panic, fuzzied with perhaps we've had a bit to drink, we've got to think straight now. What are we gonna, what are we going to do?
And did any of them, to your knowledge, did anybody know how to use administer CPR or?
So they called the emergency services very quickly.
Right, okay.
But what we don't know is how effective what they were trying to do in that interim for the emergency services to be on the scene was done. So we don't know how effective.
And guidance sometimes does change, doesn't it, with CPR as well? Yeah. As we know, how many breaths or rescue breaths and all of that.
And I don't think at 18 most young people would go, right, okay, I've got CPR at the front end of my memory. I'd need to do it.
Yeah, you think you're invincible anyway at that age, don't
that
you?
just that pure panic for them.
And they were on the so they were still on the beach. Like presumably there wasn't a defibrillator or
no. So the defibrillator wasn't there until the ambulance arrived.
Do you know how long it took for the
No,
ambulance to arrive?
we were at the inquest. So it was a number of minutes, but in that time, obviously, if you've not got a defibrillator and you've not got effective CPR, you've got a brain without oxygen. I know all this now. I didn't know that at the time. This is all the knowledge I've learned now.
Yeah.
But actually, every moment that somebody is without oxygen and without blood being pumped around their body is detrimental to the outcome that they're going to have. And it's that early intervention, piece. I genuinely don't know, even if there was a defibrillator nearby. I mean, we're years on now. So now you can call. Generally, people have got more defibrillators in their locale.
Did you find yourself in the initial months or years asking yourself constantly, these sorts of questions?
I think that the questions at the time were just, what on earth has caused it? What has suddenly effectively made him go into cardiac arrest? What's made him stop breathing? So that was all the initial question. Why has it happened? Less about the treatment of.
And you found out fairly quickly then that he had cardiomyopathy from that point. Yeah,
so he had a post-mortem, and the cardiologist had said that they'd not seen for some time a heart like it in the condition that it was in, because it was so damaged. What had happened was, if you think about the 4 chambers of the heart, the right ventricle, so one of the lower chambers, has stretched and has grown. So effectively blood is going in, but is not being able to be pumped out effectively.
Right.
And slowly that has an impact on your body, which means that your heart, the muscle just can't do it, just can't bump anymore.
So it's almost working harder than...
Yeah, absolutely. And the only way that you pick up that sort of injury or that sort of condition is with an ECG. Well, I mean, who walks around and has an ECG when they're 18? Nobody.
Yeah.
Maybe if you're a professional footballer, maybe, because that you hear a lot of that now in sport. Screening. But actually for genuine young people, and if you look back at images of him as a teenager, he looked terrible. And when I say terrible, not his fashion sense.
He'd be really,
he'd be delighted when you say that.
Fatty, what are you talking about?
Exactly. But he had really, really grey eyes.
Right.
He was very thin, and he always looked absolutely knackered.
But then he was at university.
He was at university. Yeah, totally.
Eating badly, going out,
absolutely.
Working hard for finals or whatever.
Absolutely. Worked in a pub.
Yeah.
He was enjoying, as most university students do. So some of the indicators were there, but they were muddied in with the fact that he was a student. So nobody had... And in fact, some of the questions later on were, he had complained of chest pains.
Oh, gosh.
When he ran, one friend reported being on a night out with him and they were walking up a hill and he'd said, my chest is hurting. And you think back and think, oh my God, why didn't you go to the doctor? But,
But again, these are things that sometimes even now, never mind when you're a student and that age, you just pass off as something and nothing.
And I think for a parent, I think for my mum and dad hearing that, my mum, you lose that when they move out of your house, because you've not got your eyes on them to nag them and say, and I experienced that as well now. But so he had a post-mortem, and then because of the nature of what happened, in the sense that there was alcohol, they'd been out with alcohol, there'd been a group of them where Matt had died, so he died on a beach, and various other things, it had to go to inquest. And they explained to us that was very normal, that we didn't need to think, but they needed to rule out that nothing untoward had happened. We were never in any doubt. We never thought that anything dodgy had happened, but they have to do that. And so for my parents, they had to sit through an inquest where his friends were interviewed. They were also talking about his lifestyle. they asked things like units of alcohol that he drank, all those sorts of things that my parents really didn't need to hear, but they had to sit through.
And otherwise you would never really know.
Yeah, absolutely. But all his friends had the same account. It was very, it was what happened. He'd gone into cardiac arrest as a result of a very serious heart condition, and then they weren't able to bring him back, and he died. Tragic.
God, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it's tragic. But could you do anything differently? You sort of question whether you could do anything differently. God, you wish you'd just now, when we'd seen him and he'd looked a bit tired, gone, what's going on here, bro? And if he'd mentioned chest pain, getting him checked out. One thing he did do as a adult, sort of in his late teens, was that he travelled a lot. So he went away for various charity activities.
Like the Outward Bound.
Yeah, that's right. But even more so than that. He went to Uganda, for example, to help build a community centre. As you do.
Wow.
The guy was a hero. And but we're very lucky. We still stand by the fact that we're very lucky that he didn't die somewhere outside of the UK, because that further, getting people home and all that.
Yeah, doesn't bear thinking about.
So, and we hear those cases, we hear those stories because obviously we've connected with other families who've been affected in a similar way, and there's been some really quite tragic circumstances that have made ours seem almost the better of the lot, if that makes sense,
Did that sort of, because I was going to ask you, how do you even begin, to put your lives back, it must, I know it will affect your family deeply, it always will, won't it?
Yeah.
But how you begin to look forward, and I guess some comfort from sharing with other families who have just experienced.
Yeah, well actually at the time a lot of the stuff that the other family pieces sort of come latterly really, but and more recent, I guess, probably to the nature of the fact that I've been working in first aid.
Yeah.
In the early days, in preparation for his funeral, it was just this motions, people visiting. I was at my parents' house in Bristol, and there was just flowers, and hundreds and hundreds of cards. My family, my parents, hugely popular. They've lived in the same area of Bristol all their lives, so they have they're also very much part of their local church, so they had this huge community that just rallied, and his funeral was massive. They had to have screens in other halls because they couldn't get everybody in the church.
Oh, gosh.
And I can still remember his wake. And we went to the local village hall, and Mum and Dad had said to me, would you like to say something? And I was like, yeah, I will, I'll do it. And I said to my uncle, it was so noisy because there were so many people, hundreds and hundreds of people there packed into this hall. And I said to my uncle, how are they going to hear me? Because I don't have a microphone. And he went, Kate, you'd hear a pin drop. And I was like, really? And they just tapped a glass for me to get up. And I thanked everybody for coming and told everybody about the fact that my brother, whenever he wanted to break wind, I'm being polite, used to say to me, pull my finger. That's what he used to do. And I thought, I've got to tell something that is going to make people laugh. And that's what I did. And and you never think you're going to stand somewhere when you're in your early 20s and see people toasting your brother.
No.
Just shocking.
There must have been a lot of love in that room.
Huge. And there has continued to be. And I think, there's been some, pretty dark times for everybody, and some moments where you really miss him, and I don't have any other siblings. So I became an only child overnight. And
that comes as well with its own kind of pressures, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And being, and also this, it's me now for Mum and Dad. I am it, and so a huge sense of feeling that I need to be everything that they need. We don't. I always think, I wonder where he'd be now. Would he be
a dad?
Absolutely. Would are my kids having cousins and all that sort of stuff. And it still sometimes hits you like a truck.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you go, oh, yeah, this is pretty crap. But
it's the grief, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And my mum and dad are amazing. They are amazing. And I think, you know, they were looking after me whilst also grieving hugely themselves, because nobody ever imagines that they're going to be at their own child's funeral. It's not the order of life.
I can't imagine that there's I just can't imagine not worse, that doesn't even go there, does it? A scenario, like you say, it's not the order of things, but the level of loss is just...
And how we're not fixing things, that's the wrong word, but how we're making well of it is there's a couple of things that have happened for my mum and dad. One is that when I had my eldest son, Alfie is very like my brother.
In nature
looks, everything. And my mum and dad had a focus when he was born, and this was many years later.
Right.
And people said to them, you won't know love until you have a grandchild. And it's so true. And he is their... They call him Matt all the time. Alfie's like, I'm called Alfie. And so there's a lot of that they had this real place to channel, you know. And then obviously we've gone on and had loads of kids, so we've got lots of children to occupy them with. So we have that. And then also this piece for me, which is this creating a first aid business where I can't change what happened to my brother. But if for someone else, and someone else experiences someone going into cardiac arrest, and they can say, look, I did what I could do because I knew how to do it, then I've done my job, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that sort of going forward.
Yeah.
I imagine that did you channel a lot of what happened into, do you think, creating this business, which essentially, I mean, you know, Mini First Aid is all about empowering people to save lives, isn't it?
And it took 10 years more after my brother had died, before this started to happen. It was one of those underlying niggles. And I know some people, when they experience, or some families, when they experience tragedy, go straight into fundraising and straight into making a difference in the arena and I don't know why we didn't do that. I think maybe there was just too much shock. We needed to learn to live again with this hole in our lives that could never be filled.
Yeah.
And so actually I've come to the fundraising side of stuff, the awareness stuff, and obviously the education piece a bit later. But actually what it's meant is that I can do it most of the time now without crying. Yeah, so it's still very raw, but it's not so raw that I can't get on with it. You know? So.
Yeah, and in the fact that you have talked about things briefly before, but and done interviews and things.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can't imagine you'd been able to do that for quite a long time.
No. No, it was very. It's very weird.
Yeah. And then so going back to this whole idea of sort of what you were starting Mini First Aid, and then obviously originally you started. It was baby and toddler first aid, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think then actually in what happened to Matt has very much been in this whole idea around knowing how to do CPR has been your motivation for creating this new adult awareness class?
Absolutely. I think when I did the first piece of Mini First Aid around the babies and young children, that's where I was. You know, I had this precious baby boy. And then more children, but you know, Alfie initially and then Grace, where if anything had happened to them, and I knew it, right? I knew this feeling. I'd seen it with my parents, what it was like to lose a child, and I could not, if it was possible to prevent that, have that happen to my children. The whole, we'd done it. We couldn't have any more tragedy in our family.
Were you very anxious when you had the children to start with? You know, that whole, if you've had such loss and you're like you say, I can't have anything like this happening again in my life.
When we've had situations where things have happened where Alfie, for example, we found out when Alfie was very little that he is completely deaf in one ear, and my reaction to that was grief. pure grief. I was grieving for what he wasn't going to have, or what I assumed he wasn't going to have. His hearing, his ability to join in, know what's happening, do certain jobs, whatever that was, at his tiny 4 weeks old. And it was grief that hit me. And so without a doubt, whenever we have a health worry, which we get all the time, as typical parents will get with our children, is sometimes I overplay that, and sometimes I'll go, I think there's something really wrong here.
Yeah, but it's a total human reaction, isn't it? You go from 0 to 110 because we're a product of all the things that have
Absolutely, and I know that there's a question sometimes you get asked about from doctors, particularly in the arena of mental health, and they'll say to you, do you ever get that sense of impending doom? And you go, yeah, I do. I actually do. You know, my kids are poorly, and I think, oh my goodness, please let this not be something. So that never goes away.
Yeah.
But certainly the work piece allows me to go, right, we've got the knowledge, we know what we're doing, and I can act on it. And when I have had to act in a first aid situation, people say, Kate, you're really cool, you're really calm with it. And it's like, well, it's well practiced now, it's well practiced. And then when it came to teaching adult first aid, absolutely, it was the most next natural step when we were ready to acknowledge how much Matt had shaped our lives and how much we needed to make sure that no one else ever had to be on the scene of a cardiac arrest and maybe not know what to do. You know, we needed everybody to be confident if it happened to them,
Yeah. So what would be, I suppose, you know, that Matt is totally essential. I mean, you could almost call it the Matt Cooper class, couldn't you? I know that not everybody would know that.
He'd laugh from his cloud.
Matt Cooper. He'd be like, why are you calling it my name? You know, but it's very much with him in mind. But the motivation is essentially you don't want the same thing to happen to any other family, but also to empower people to be confident. What would your message be? To have the skills
and
to know what to do.
Skills and confidence. It's one of those things that it's better to know it and not need it than need it and not know it. And that's the reality that we fall into. And we talk to families all the time where something's happened and they say, I panicked and I didn't know what to do. And if we can do one thing, it's to take that panic away and go, I've got this knowledge, I know what I'm doing. And whether that is somebody bleeding or whether that's somebody in cardiac arrest or you suspect somebody's having a stroke or whatever that is that you go, I've been taught this and I know what I'm doing. Yeah.
So just talking in a little bit more detail about the awareness and sort of what it's all about. It's distinct from the baby and toddler first aid, but I guess when I think about first aid, I think about sort of the first aid at work or the day's course that you have to do. Now, I take it the adult awareness is different to that.
That's right. So anybody that does a first aid qualification course are usually doing those courses because of a position in their work. So they need it to be the first aider. And so perhaps people have got associations with that about the length of the course or perhaps going to a training centre, etc. And whilst many first aid teach qualification courses, there is a gap for those people that say, I don't need it for my job, but I just want to know. Because if somebody collapsed in front of me, would I know what to do? And the way we talk about it is that if something happens from the moment that an accident or very sudden onset of an illness happens to the point when the ambulance arrives, depending on where you are in the UK and depending on the pressures on the NHS currently, etc., is that you could wait 8, 12 or even longer in minutes for somebody to come on the scene who is an expert. So in that interim time, it's you are the person. And so it's that bit that says, right, we'll teach you what to do. So it's less about beautiful bandaging and splints and perhaps making stretchers, and instead it's about thinking, right, somebody's stopped breathing, how do I check? And then what do I do? And how do I get people to help me to deal with that situation in the moment?
Okay, and have Mini First Aid designed that course?
And that format that works, that all the bits around that make that accessible and a really good learning experience, and applied the same to adult first aid. So all the things that you would typically imagine to happen to an adult in a first aid emergency, and that's what we teach in 2 hours. But you can do the whole lot wearing your slippers, and there's no such thing as a stupid question. and you're not being tested at the end. What we want is the adults that are attending to leave going, I've got that now, and I know what I'm doing. And God forbid it happens to me or to one of my loved ones or to somebody in the street. If I'm the first there, I'd know what I was doing.
Yeah. So it sounds like one of those courses also that you might want to do once every... Because I know that I felt when I'd done a first aid course, it was actually a mini first aid course, actually I want to do this every few years.
Absolutely, revisit it. Yeah, absolutely, refresh your memory, absolutely. So we don't set a prescriptive time scale to say to people, you've got to come back and do this every certain number of years. It's more about how you feel. And sometimes that can be a change in personal circumstances. So it might be that perhaps someone in your family has been unwell or has been diagnosed with a condition that you say, actually...
I need to know
this.
Yeah.
We also hear so much more now about people taking care of not only their babies and children, but also looking after their parents or older people in their family, and the responsibilities that comes with home caring, or even perhaps just that their relatives are aging and things are happening. And sometimes it might be that an emergency has happened to a family friend and it's triggered some thinking that goes, oh my gosh, if this happened to us, we wouldn't know what we were doing. And so, or you might witness something. You might be a witness on the scene of an accident and think, thank goodness I wasn't the one that had to give the first aid, because I wouldn't have known what to do. And it's all of those things rolled into a really caring, reassuring, accessible and easy to remember class. I don't want people leaving confused. I want people leaving going, yep, I've got that.
And so playing devil's advocate here, so what you've mentioned is, this a succinct but vital first aid course. There are a lot of other providers out, in terms of first aid, aren't there? What's different about this course and about what mini first aid is offering here?
So our style of teaching, we spend a huge amount of our invested time with our trainers around them being the sort of trainers that we want them to be, and so much of that is around their style of teaching, and that is applying different styles of teaching in the class itself. So you might have somebody attending perhaps that loves writing notes, you might have somebody else that loves being hands-on, you might have someone that's a real question asker all the way through, you might have somebody that just wants to sit and watch. And what we have to do in our lessons is make sure that our teaching style engages with all of those people, so that everybody feels that they have been spoken to in that session. And that's not just something that all trainers can do. That style of teaching and teaching to reach different people's different learning styles is a really quite a big skill to be able to have. So we do a huge amount of skills training around there. Also, we need to make sure that our knowledge is absolutely up to date. So whereas first aid industry-wide, if you're a first aid instructor, you're required to renew your own qualifications, your own expertise every 3 years. In mini first aid, our trainers are continually developing. So we are continually feeding them first aid updates. And that's not just sending them an email with a list, but that is that we have every month we have a new speaker coming to speak to our trainers to teach them something that's topical, that's happening in the world of health and first aid education, so that our trainers are completely on top of research, what's happening in medicine, developments, as things change, we're on the front foot rather than responding to things. And that's just made sure that when you have a class, it's absolutely up to the moment. So it's the trainers themselves, it's the knowledge that they're delivering, and then partner that with the accessibility piece, which is you don't need to go to a training centre or a big training building to go on a first aid course. You can have a first aid course in your kitchen. On the kitchen floor is absolutely fine. And you can invite your friends and family around, and you know what, you can also do it at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night if you want to, or 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning. So we fit around the needs of our customers to make sure that we bring training to them and it's accessible. And I don't mind if you're doing a course and you're bouncing a baby on your lap whilst you're listening to us, that's fine. Or perhaps you're saying, I've invited all my neighbours in, and do you mind if we stop in the middle because we're all going to have something to eat together, or however that's going to work. The idea is that we're framing these classes to rule out any issues that people might have, or give us a reason for not
making
attending.
it sort of accessible to everybody.
Absolutely. And we're certainly not going to blind anyone with science. This is about the facts. This is what you see. One of the big pieces for us with this course recently is also how much is emerging from data and from health experts, and also from the media as well, around the differences between men and women in first aid and how women are treated in first aid. So just for example, is that we are embodying this idea without even realising that we assume that women don't have heart attacks. So women don't go into cardiac arrest. Or that if a woman did go into cardiac arrest, I can't touch her because I have to put my hands on her breasts and on her underwear, and I've got to expose her chest. And one of the things that we do in the adult awareness first aid class is we talk about that, and we actually show, with a very special mannequin that's female shaped, is that we show learners how to place their hands, but also how to approach a casualty with dignity, but also so that they can feel confident to give first aid to a woman if she was in cardiac arrest, which is hugely important. And that's going to be a massive, massive game change for mini first aid and the way that people are seeing how they respond in a first aid situation. The other thing that we're doing in our teaching is that we're also making sure that we embody in our language use, but also in our teaching, about how you approach people with skin that is a different colour. Now, this might seem a very obvious thing to say, but actually, if a black person has burnt themselves, their burn is going to look very different. They don't need to be treated differently, but when I'm looking at it, I need to know what I'm looking for. And actually, if a black person or somebody with brown skin is choking, that their indicators of how they look is going to be different than perhaps somebody with white skin.
Oh, of course, because the language around it, like we classically say, somebody goes pale, or
yeah, absolutely. Or red.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Or I suppose with, I'm just thinking out loud, but rashes or whatever it might be.
Absolutely.
A lot of our descriptions.
And so we embody all of that in our training.
Yeah.
And again, that's a hugely important thing for accessibility, because we don't want anybody to rule out attending our courses based on the colour of their skin, to say, well, this isn't applicable to me, I won't learn.
Or to not see themselves reflected in class language or materials or whatever it might be. Yeah,
so that piece has been so important for us in the creation of the adult awareness course, but that's also reflected in all of our other teaching as well. And it might surprise you to know that that doesn't happen in the first aid industry. We're doing something different in both what we're teaching, but also in the knowledge and the skill set of our trainers.
So really sort of, I guess, leading the field in terms of first aid education. Mini first aid is right there.
Absolutely, yeah. And and that's all about what we do, because actually first aid is very simple, and even I can say that with a first aid company. First aid itself is very simple, its application is actually simple, but the key thing is how you teach it so that people feel like that, and they feel it's accessible, they feel that the knowledge applies to them and they know what they're doing.
Yeah. I think it's brilliant. I think it's incredible what you're doing. And I just think, mini first aid as a business is, empowering so many people and has already empowered so many parents. But what you're doing here, in that taking something that is ultimately been just so difficult and just a massive tragedy for you and your family, and keeping Matt's memory alive, but essentially empowering people to, to know what to do in those situations is just amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today, and please check out and subscribe to all our social channels to keep up to date with our latest episodes. I'd also like to ask you to view the video of the podcast of mine and Jackie's interview together. That's available on our YouTube channel. Please do subscribe to the remaining podcasts from this series from your usual preferred podcast platform. If there are any topics that you would like us to discuss in the future, we would absolutely love to hear from you. And please do let us know what you think about the topics that we've covered so far as well. Thank you for listening to Family Health by Mini First Aid. I take Savlon Scar Prevention Gel everywhere with me so that I'm always prepared for the many little and sometimes bigger accidents that my kids encounter. Thank you again to Savlon Prevention Gel for sponsoring Series 1 of the Family Health by Mini First Aid podcast.